Okay, well, thank you for joining us for the 7th Ocean Nexus webinar. This event is presented by Nippon Foundation and Ocean Nexus. Our funder, Nippon Foundation, is an international philanthropic organization promoting action to achieve a society in which all people support one another. So as Ocean Nexus Center is a research network of scholars who conduct our research with empathy by employing anti-racist, decolonization, and intersectionality as our analytical lens. As a group, our mission is to establish social equity at the center of ocean governance. And the center has been going on for the last 5 years. My name is Yoshi Ota. I'm the director of Ocean Nexus and a professor at the University of Rhode Island. Today's webinar, critical step for just transition. And this is our response to the trendy movement with renewable energy development. In the climate change era we are in, people say it is necessary for us to seek for alternative energy, and those Green New Deals or new push for renewable energy also has to be done in the manner of in a just manner. And the US policy of just transition was already out there calling for communities' benefit, and also the concern about the value chain not going into somewhere else, but to stay within the national and the regional and the state benefit. So, this understanding of the just transition, we have so many questions. What does it mean? Who is it justice for? How are we going to achieve it? So we really like to start talking or starting our discussion today, talking kind of like against those sort of like adjectives saying like, oh, because it's urgent or it's realistic, it has to have a vision and those terms. But we really wanted to just dig in. What do we mean by the just and expand our knowledge? Okay, I have many presenters today. I'm very glad because we've been working on this. So Dr. Matthew Jerome Schneider is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and he's also co-director of the Sustainability, Equity, and Action SEAC Lab, together with Dr. Brian O'Neill. Dr. Leah Fusco is a geographer with research interest in energy development and just energy transitions, environmental policy and planning, impact assessment, climate justice, and equitable blue economies. So if you guys have anything that you wanted to question about those topics, just reach out to Dr. Fusco. She received a PhD in human geography from University of Toronto, where she conducted research on environmental assessment and review processes related to offshore oil development and fracking in Newfoundland and Labrador. Leah, it's great to have you. And, Leah is our Nexus Fellow, so I'm glad to have Leah to speak about this topic. We also have two experts, Kammin and Ellison, who were student in SME, School of Marine and Environmental Affairs in Washington University, worked on thesis on labor and also community benefit, both pretty much on just transition. And so I invited both of them who are now working in that sector to give us a comment, what's their thesis all about and what's their opinion now they are working actually in practice on this just transition. So we're going to start with Dr. Schneider's presentation, followed by Dr. Fusco's presentation, and we'll ask Kurt and Will to give us a comment and also introduce some of the new topics if they wanted to. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to pass the floor to Matthew.
All right. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm sharing my screen now. Yeah, so I'm thrilled to be here. I want to start by thanking Yoshi and Ariel Wang for inviting me and for all the organization efforts. I'm quite flattered to be here. Because we're going to be talking about renewable energy today, which is a politicized topic, I also need to note that although the remarks I prepared are grounded in the social scientific literature, the opinions expressed here are my own and do not represent that of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. So today I'm going to be talking about reimagining the renewable energy transition, or the need to make the just transition more than just a transition. So I also wanted to give a shout out to my friend and frequent collaborator, Brian O'Neill. He and I have been developing this commentary piece, or this, conceptual piece for some time now, and hopefully it'll be coming to a peer-reviewed journal near you soon. I'll also note that Brian's a wonderful photographer, and most of the images that follow are his. So, as many scholars of environmental issues will recognize, there is a tremendous emphasis for academics to make an impact in their work and to engage with community stakeholders. In fact, "we need social scientists" has become a common refrain for government and private sector private sector actors, excuse me. So in recent years, we found ourselves in, for lack of a better word, discussion spaces that resemble some mix of faculty meeting, graduate seminar, and town hall, in which, at least rhetorically, this call for social science is outwardly projected. As social scientists who are concerned with the just transition, we've been especially keen to intervene in any discourse about renewable energies that we can, drawing from our research, and we hope to bring our insights and indeed our imaginations to bear on these issues. And so in November 2023, we were in Washington State to meet with some scholars and practitioners interested in coastal and offshore wind in the American Northwest. As part of these meetings, one collaborator organized a session that resembled a community visioning project. Although no one called it that at the time, the premise was simple. We were asked a two-part question. Are we supportive of expanded offshore wind capabilities? And if offshore wind is going to exist in the American Northwest, what should it look like? As we went around the table, the mix of scholars and practitioners that were present described wind projects that were small in scale. They advocated for projects that would bring stable power to remote communities and local projects that would provide power to the immediately surrounding community. Without using the language directly, the participants in the visioning activity articulated a desire for more democratic energy systems that would prioritize local input, production, and impact. What is notable, of course, is that a democratic and socio-ecologically conscious transition is not usually what is being offered by energy companies, who on the West Coast propose miles of underwater energy cables and floating turbines that are likely to exceed 300 feet tall. When I pointed out that the vision that was expressed by the group was different than the likely coming reality, I was surprised to be met with outrage from some members of the group. One member of the group accused me, and academics more generally, of being unrealistic and out of touch. Another participant more kindly added that energy needs are only going to grow, and that the energy transition will require immense levels of capital investment. Mega projects then were the best available option. And truly, I and my closest collaborators are sympathetic to the pro-wind positions expressed here. And as we navigate these meetings, we find ourselves feeling misunderstood. The climate crisis is pressing, and like our colleagues, academic or otherwise, we've dedicated huge portions of our career to the issue. We agree that renewable energy is now widely lauded as having tremendous potential for moving societies beyond fossil fuel dependence. And what is more, there's strong public support for expanded wind and solar capabilities in the US. However, the more time we spend in these stakeholder discussions and community visioning meetings, the more problems we see. As we engage in these meetings, there's a strange narrowing of the field of visions that are laid before us. The problem, at least in our reading, is that investment in renewable energies does not necessarily promise a transition away from fossil fuels, nor does it promise the adoption of renewable energies that will be just. In the US context, even as record amounts of renewable energy are being produced, it can also be observed that offlining of coal and natural gas facilities in the United States has been slow. And in recent years, under both Presidents Trump and Biden, US production of oil and natural gas hit record highs. Furthermore, as proponents of a just transition, we worry that uncritical acquiescence to corporate energy giants such as Duke Energy and Avangrid in the United States will serve to exacerbate longstanding inequities. In the US context, there is an especially long and rich connection between capitalist modes of production and the generation and maintenance of social inequality. Indeed, some scholars argue that in the age of climate crisis, we run the risk of creating a climate apartheid, quote unquote, if we fail to confront the ongoing legacies of colonialism, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchy that are built into our current climate change response. Thus, in this presentation, I consider the implications of the renewable energy transition and ask how we might begin to work toward a truly just transition. Following Tim Ingold's recent interventions in climate policy, this presentation is an attempt at critical imagination. Ultimately, I argue that for the renewable energy transition to be a just transition, we must begin with radical, transformative intentions, even as we recognize the need for immediate, incremental, and context-specific implementation. If there's something that society needs, it's to begin to think in ways that seem currently unrealistic, because what is sure is that the recent history of being realistic continues to deliver a punishing mix of a punishing, unequal, and unjust world ecology. So, what exactly is the just transition? Just transition is not a new idea. The phrase dates back to at least the 1970s when Tony Mazzocchi, a trade union leader with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union, proposed financial support and education opportunities for workers who would be displaced by elimination or automation of jobs associated with environmental hazards. Since then, and especially in recent years, the idea of a just transition has been adopted by a range of actors and has moved beyond labor efforts to reflect a growing awareness and a concern about deepening inequities between the world's rich and poor, and how climate and environmental crises and efforts to address them are accentuating these inequalities. The just transition is not only associated with organized labor then, but also with conceptions of social justice, theories of socio-technical transition, governance strategies, and a tool for understanding public attitudes towards energy transitions and land use practices. One of the more common uses of the just transition framework is by those advocating for a transition away from regional dependence on coal extraction. As environmental legislation and fossil fuel economies change and threaten jobs of workers in the coal industry, scholars have begun to examine how unions and governments can or should manage the displacement of this workforce. Examining the case of Wyoming's Powder River Basin, the largest coal mining region in the United States, Mei-Jin Cha argues that it's imperative that governments manage the decline of the coal industry to prevent the economic distress that comes with sudden closures of coal mines. More recently, Alexander Dunlap and Diego Marin have taken a especially critical look at the coal renewables nexus, stating the issue bluntly that policymakers and climate adaptation scholars are too often overlooking complexity, flattening reality, and ignoring the role of capitalism. This critique of the flat ontology of adaptation and so-called sustainability science is needed and welcome, as such an approach points to the need for rigorous analyses and studies that take the unevenness and dispossessions embedded within contemporary transition logics seriously. So in the context of a move towards low carbon energy production, what does this entail? Following Cha, it would mean accounting for the negative economic and social impacts created by this yet to be realized transition. Accounting for the displacement of workers currently in the fossil fuel industry is a central concern for just transition for a good reason. However, transition, especially when considered as a part of a larger social project, not just a technological one, also raises questions about social, racial, and environmental justice. Thus, as renewable energies and the larger industries expand in the United States, one could easily find it reassuring to see governments, companies, and communities engaging seriously with ideas that would, at least in principle, create union-protected employment opportunities for displaced workers and for historically marginalized communities. Framed in this way, renewable energy industry and policy packages like the Green New Deal are tools that can help right the racial injustices of the post-war era and the New Deal era, right the wrongs of the 20th century land use practices, and right the wrongs of other public and private projects that have excluded or harmed minoritized and low-income communities. For example, as states on the East Coast of the United States make plans for offshore wind farms and more solar fields, renewable energy projects are increasingly framed as an opportunity for social and racial justice by politicians, industry officials, and news outlets. By locating training facilities and high-paying jobs in economically depressed regions in segregated towns and cities, the emerging wind industry is not only an opportunity to secure a low-carbon future, nor is it only an opportunity to restore America's manufacturing economy. By this logic, it is a chance to secure and distribute the economic economic benefits of industrial investment more equitably. Yet, it's important to critically evaluate the promises of a just renewable energy transition. Perhaps most obviously, it's worth questioning whether the transition to renewable energies actually represents a move away from fossil fuels. At present, evidence of an energy boomerang effect is compelling. The energy boomerang effect suggests that market-based energy systems funnel increased investment into renewable energy development, and that actually works against sustainable outcomes. As renewable energy technologies expand, downward pressure is exerted on energy prices, which in turn increases demand. Increased demand thus spurs additional investment and greater production, effectively preventing the transition away from the original fossil fuel energy production method and market contexts. As Ozzie Zahner argues, in the existing American context, increasing alternative energy production will not displace fossil fuel side effects, but will instead simply add more side effects to the mix. Instead of a world with the dreadful side effects of fossil fuels, we will enter into a future world with the dreadful side effects of fossil fuels plus the dreadful side effects of alternative energy technologies. And indeed, renewable energies are not, as they're sometimes called, a free gift with little to no environmental consequences. For one thing, the production of renewable energy requires the mining of precious minerals, such as cobalt, zinc, and lithium. It requires the smelting of steel, the fabrication of solar panels, and the shipping of these materials around the world. It also requires the disposal of degraded materials. Lithium, for example, is needed in large quantities to create batteries for energy storage, the largest harvestable source of which lies in South America's lithium triangle between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. The process of lithium mining is environmentally disruptive and a source of conflict between local indigenous communities and companies invested in the mineral's extraction. This has led to scholars like Daniela Soto Hernandez and Peter Newell calling this a process of renewable extraction. They argue that this points to the importance of poverty and inequality in many contexts, their close relationship to class, race, and gender as determinants of who are likely to be the beneficiaries of the new wave of extractivism and who is likely to inhabit the sacrifice zones that resource it. All of this in renewable energies aren't even carbon-free. As Alexander Dunlap argues, it would be at best more honest to term renewables as fossil fuel plus technologies, as the production of steel and the extraction and transportation of minerals around the world are carbon-intensive processes. Thus, the development of renewable energy technologies, if implemented uncritically, is likely to represent the next chapter in capitalist extractivism and reproduce or widen existing social inequities. Additionally, as has been observed by anthropologist Jaume Franquesa, the implementation of wind energy projects in Southern Catalonia has followed a series of decades-long energy investments. In each case, whether we're talking about dams, oil refineries, nuclear reactors, or wind turbines, every new energy project has been justified by presenting the region, its inhabitants, their practices, and so on as waste. Recessive agriculture, lagging development, absence of profit-making, etc. Each new round of energy investment has been presented by the state and the energy sector as an opportunity to redeem the area from its underdevelopment, perceived in comparison to other regions of Spain and Europe. So, stepping back and taking the long view of development then raises questions about the supposed justice of the transition, suggesting instead that under contemporary capitalist status quo, the implementation of renewable energy technologies is likely to be dependent upon the ability to identify the next extractable commodity and the maintenance of inequity. Under the current market framing, these processes of extraction, environmental degradation, and marginalization are invisibilized. investment in renewable energy, which will bring us clean air and good jobs, is unquestionably the right thing to do, so the argument goes. At least for the moment, there's no space for critique because following this logic, critique isn't needed. However, this self-evident and overly rational presentation of renewable energies as climate mitigation strategies only rings true if there is no alternative to capitalist expansion and accumulation. Well, it's not our position that renewable energy technologies have no place in visions for a more sustainable future. I should be clear about that. But blind belief in technological advancement alone is at best incredibly risky. At worst, such an approach justifies continued environmental degradation, resource extraction by and to the benefit of political and economic elites. So, what can we do? When viewed through a critical lens, two obvious questions present themselves. First, given these drawbacks, why is there so much excitement around renewable energy? Undoubtedly, greenwashing and techno-optimistic modes of thinking are at play. But it's also true that the climate crisis is a pressing crisis, and the temptation to take what appears to be the least worst option is strong. And again, it's our opinion that renewable energy technologies, if implemented thoughtfully, could play a meaningful role in decarbonization. Thus, the second obvious question arises. How can we ensure that renewable energy technologies, the renewable energy transition is truly a just transition? In recent years, a common answer has been to strike community benefits agreements between the hosting community, the local and regional governments, and the private developers. For offshore wind projects, CBAs are in fact advocated for by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. These agreements vary, but generally speaking, benefits promised by the host community might include financial incentives, infrastructure investment, and/or community empowerment measures such as input in decision-making processes. These agreements are not without risk. For example, as renewable energy projects grow in scale, community benefit agreements or no, the potential for ecological disruption grows, as do concerns about distributional justice. Additionally, the financial incentives and economic impacts, such as job creation promised by the industry, also pose certain risks. If renewable energy industries do in fact represent the next chapter of capitalist extraction, we are likely to see relationships between industry, host communities, and labor that build on past industrial legacies. Might community benefit agreements between host communities and corporate actors justify local dependence on the industry to supply jobs, as we've seen in carbon-rich regions like the Diné Nation and in Labrador, Canada? Alternatively, might the jobs created by such projects go to transient employees rather than locals, employees that rotate around the country, as is often seen in the natural gas industry? To be sure, if used cautiously, CBAs are likely to benefit local communities in tangible ways, especially compared against communities that have no such agreements. However, CBAs do little to combat the inequities built into macro-level processes of capital accumulation, extraction, and energy production, nor do they promise to curb consumer demand. Thus, the countermeasure against corporate extraction and as a way of addressing both procedural and distributional environmental justice concerns could be localized in democratic energy systems. In a system of renewable energy co-ops, for example, local communities would jointly own and produce their own power. Successful renewable energy co-ops are associated with a range of positive economic, social, and psychological outcomes, including public acceptance of sustainability and conservation measures, and the burden is created by the community that's actually using the power. Last, but perhaps most importantly, it's imperative that radical conversations about eco-socialist approaches to production and consumption, approaches such as degrowth, be taken more seriously. As has been noted, the implementation of renewable energy into the energy grid is unlikely to result in a move away from fossil fuels under our current economic system. Transition to a new economic system that does not center growth does feel impossible. And indeed, it doesn't come without challenges. At this time, it is also abundantly clear, though, that business as usual approaches to renewable energy development are neither sustainable nor equitable. Thus, in an age of climate crisis, radical paths forward are in fact the most realistic. As part of our training, social scientists are often exposed to something we call critical theory. The goal of critical theorists is not to solely provide social critique, but to leverage such critique towards social change. Now is a time to exercise our imaginations and push beyond the artificially imposed frameworks of understanding imposed on us in service to the interest of capital. Realistically, such a change can't happen at the snap of one's fingers, and if one could manage such a feat, the rapid change could be destabilizing. Thus, this presentation concludes by advocating for radical incrementalism. Radical incrementalism is a disposition and a sensibility that believes in deliberate actions of social transformation through a multiplicity of processes and imaginations, none of which assumes or asserts primary significance over other struggles. It provides a means to confront the struggle and perpetually work one's way through it, stumbling across what works and what does not. From this perspective, the answer to what can we do to ensure a just transition is to look to all of the above options and beyond. But answers should be context dependent, should be bottom up, and should be radical in their goals. With the recent election of Donald Trump, climate experts worry about the future of U.S. climate policy, expanded oil and natural gas drilling in Alaska, and declining investments in renewables. Trump has even promised to block development of offshore wind projects through executive action on day one. And while an American president who denies the reality of climate change is likely to have catastrophic impacts, it means now more than ever there is a need to simultaneously, incrementally make policy demands that protect local communities, take local steps to democratize our energy systems, and forcefully advocate for transparent and less harmful modes of energy production. If nothing else, Trump's election reminds us of the urgency of the moment, and perhaps even provides us a chance to move beyond the blind belief that interests of the state and interests of capital will converge to deliver just outcomes. Again, now is perhaps a moment to recognize and attempt to move beyond the ideological constraints that have conditioned us to accept the status quo as the only realistic way forward. Thank you all so much for having me. I look forward to your questions. I'll turn it over to Leah.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for that great presentation, and to Yoshi and Nexus for inviting me here, and to Matt for being my PowerPoint clicker. So what I wanted to highlight today is that in order for energy transitions to be equitable, we need to be using an equity lens at the start of planning projects and transition activities. So for instance, with new offshore wind projects, there is an opportunity to think through how to make sure they happen differently from other resource development like oil, so that they don't just recreate or exacerbate existing inequities. So to make this point more practical, I wanted to focus on a specific tool, Gender-Based Analysis Plus, because it's a tool that's currently required in Canada and specifically for doing impact assessments. And just as a little kind of disclaimer, I just want to say that how this approach is actually being done and currently being done by government is not imperfect, but I think it is a starting point for discussion on how it could be done. So next slide, please. So gender-based analysis is often reduced to women. For instance, how many women are employed or efforts to get more women employed in a project. Gender-Based Analysis Plus, or GBA Plus, is based on intersectional theory developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. In her original work, Crenshaw highlighted how Black women were not just experiencing racial oppression or gender oppression, but rather both at the same time. This is an important point because it highlights the complex ways that individuals experience larger structures of power and privilege in unique ways. Therefore, intersectional GBA Plus needs to be about more than just women, or even more than just gender. So the figure on the left is how intersectionality is often portrayed as the intersection of identities, often race, class, and gender. These are all important, but this image doesn't capture the complexity of systems of power in society. So the figure on the right attempts to show this. It includes more aspects of identity, but it also brings systems and structures of power into the analysis. So things like racism, colonialism, sexism, and patriarchy. In the context of project development and energy transition planning, these all come together to shape how individuals and communities experience impacts, who benefits, who doesn't, and why. So using this kind of lens when planning and assessing new projects could lead to a more thorough understanding of impacts and may help with planning more equitable projects and energy transitions. Next slide. So what this means in reality is that thinking through, assessing, and planning projects and energy transitions becomes much more complex because we're no longer considering issues in silos, but rather in relation to each other and in the context of intersecting identities and power structures. So for instance, when we talk about how many jobs will be created by a particular project or workers in energy transitions, we have to ask further questions about what kinds of jobs are created for whom. Why are some people getting the well-paid jobs and others are not? How is this shaped by systemic issues like racism, colonialism, and patriarchy? In a recent paper, we looked at employment in Newfoundland oil projects and found that most employees were men. The women who were employed were more likely to be in administrative positions, and there were very few Indigenous people and people with disabilities employed. Women and other marginalized groups are more likely to be overrepresented in lower paying jobs that may increase with resource development, like retail, food, and hospitality. In Canada, these are some of the lowest wage jobs and have more women than men working in them and often rely on temporary migrant labor. Similarly, community benefits agreements are often based on a geographical community rather than an identity-based one. So if the agreement includes something like maximizing local jobs and using local suppliers, it may also need to include measures to promote diversity of employees and suppliers, like through funding for training or business development for diverse populations, or language and cultural support for newcomers. Housing is another good example. In a recent report I read on wind development, the impacts on housing from projects were focused on visual impacts on the landscape. But in research I'm doing right now on potential impacts of offshore wind, this never came up, despite that housing came up over and over again. Rather, people talked about how increases in population would lead to an increase in housing costs and a decrease in availability, and that it was people not benefiting from high-paying jobs in industry that would be most affected by this. This pressure on housing has important links to other social issues as well, including gender-based violence. Women may be forced to stay in abusive situations if there are no other housing options, especially if shelters and transition houses are at capacity. High housing costs may also lead people to use food budgets to cover rent in order to stay in their homes. This puts people who are already food insecure at increased risk, which in Canada includes single mothers, particularly Black and Indigenous single mothers and people with disabilities. So just to conclude, Gender-based analysis plus and similar approaches is complex and challenging. It highlights interconnections between issues and points towards solutions that address systemic issues rather than solutions that remain in silos. Thus, using something like GBA plus early may help to support and plan more equitable projects and energy transitions.
Thank you very much, Leah. Okay, all the presenters, you can turn your camera on. Okay, so Matthew, Leah, both brilliant presentations. Now, I can go to the discussion first, but before going there, so I'll have two researchers and now a practitioner worked on CBA, community-based community benefit agreement, and I'm sorry, and then labor. So, Will, Kurt, would you like to share your research? And now you're in the sector trying to bring just transition from practitioner's point of view, what your experience will be, as we expected to or has been. Kurt, would you mind starting with you?
Sure. I will start and let me share my screen here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. There we go. All right. There we go. So thank you. Yeah, my name is Kurt Ellison. I am the Maritime Policy Manager for Climate Solutions. We are a regional nonprofit working in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, and Oregon, and we work on clean energy and climate policy. I'm also a former merchant mariner who used to work in the offshore energy sector. My research, as Yoshi mentioned, was on labor and equity in offshore wind in the Pacific Northwest. And in my work now, I do sit on Washington's Blue Wind Offshore Wind Supply Chain Leadership Committee. And at Climate Solutions, under my umbrella, I work on ports, vessels, and offshore energy. So one of our values at Climate Solutions when we approach our policy, so we're working at the state level, we're working often in the local level, but in the legislature. And we do have a principle of justice. So I try to bring a just transition and equity lens to all of the policy work that we're doing. And I work around a lot of issues of electrification, zero emission climate, cargo handling equipment, new marine fuels, and also offshore energy. But all of these electrification projects, which have significant impacts on local community health, require clean electrons to make these projects happen. So a lot of the stakeholders, because that I work with, and because this is a commercial and industrial space, labor is a critical element. Port and coastal communities, particularly port communities in the Pacific Northwest. Port communities also happen to be environmental justice communities frequently and have inequitable impacts from these industries. There's additional stakeholders, and then of course, the tribal nations and their sovereignty and treaty rights are a critical factor in all issues. When I look at equity in my research, I really came down to Martha Minow's work in equality versus equity, and really focusing on that you can have sharper focus through the inequality in inequity. So existing issues of inequity and inequality. So some of the assumptions that I make in my work is that energy transition is occurring, whether that is clean or just is up for debate, but there is an ongoing, always ongoing transition. So understanding these existing inequities is key to just outcomes. And if also that climate change and fossil fuel use create and or exacerbate new and existing inequalities. So maintaining that system is not just or equitable. And while clean energy projects can have inequities built into them, and we need to be mindful of that, in my view, there is no just transition without clean energy solutions. So my work looking at this framing, the rhetoric of just transition means nothing if impacted workers are not at the heart of shaping policies that affect their livelihoods and communities. This is the title of my thesis work, where I did interviews with maritime workers, worked on board vessels, worked offshore, worked in port areas. And what we uncovered is that they were more concerned with existing inequities in their workspace than either new technologies or new energy solutions. There was lots of issues of safety, health impacts, issues of assault, dealing with mental health, lack of access to and opportunity. A lot of this creating precarious work, which exacerbates inequitable solutions. But we do see an interest in transition in these quotes here. You can see, hell yeah, oh hell yeah, there's an opportunity here as long as there is a transition. That's from a marine construction worker. Or a longshore worker who's interested in electric trucks for health implications. But as long as he wants a person doing that work, and as long as we take care of people. So in the active policy space that we're working in Oregon and Washington, offshore wind policy, we run into significant challenges when we're talking about just transition and community involvement in this decision making. There is limited political will or perceived value in this work. It is hard to make that case on the legislative level. The timeline and the speed of politics, the legislature things can change during a walk down the hallway, which makes it hard to engage in these issues from a policy perspective. The other thing is engaging, because especially floating offshore wind projects do not have developed projects to react to. It's still very much conceptual. We have conflicting jurisdictions between the federal, state, and local levels with different timelines, different modes and capacities for engagement. And capacity itself is a huge problem when many of these communities are stretched very thin in all of the multitude of issues that are impacting them, and asking for more time to consult on or participate in these conversations is a challenge. So funding is also an issue there. Expectations have been an issue where community benefit agreements, when we throw everything on the table, it becomes that these solutions may solve many or all of the community's problems, and that's simply not going to be the case. And then also political capital. And I think this is really undervalued, that it takes a lot of political capital for elected officials to take a stance on these issues. We saw a major change with this when the governor of Oregon needed to effectively stand up to the federal government during the lease process and say, wait, our community, our state needs more time to engage. That was a big ask. It wasn't reported that way, but it was a big ask. But yet, despite these challenges, we are actively doing just transition models and frameworks out there in the everyday policy space of engaging with communities and working with legislatures. Two examples of that have come out of the Oregon Floating Offshore Wind Roadmap. I'll put links to this in the chat. But this came out of legislative work. There's a large amount of input in this. It's a roadmap with exit maps because it is not assuming that offshore wind will be developed, but there's a very robust series of community engagement here. Washington is doing a similar thing where they did a 250 plus interviews of tribal governments and stakeholders to get at the root of residents' concerns over offshore wind. They came back with 7 policy recommendations that were importantly brought back to those communities for review and comments, and then those have been delivered to the governor. Now, both of these scenarios are in limbo right now with the federal decisions. The states the direction is unclear, but either way, we are going to continue to be working on the state and local levels to engage in this way and seek and work towards more just outcomes in our clean energy solutions. So thank you, and that's what we're working on.
Okay, you've been working on a lot. Thanks a lot, Kurt. Will, would you like to explain about your thesis, background, context, and what your findings were on community benefit agreement in Washington State and California?
Yeah, so I researched in the Pacific Northwest, both with Ocean Nexus and the Clean Energy Transition Institute, which focuses on pathways to net zero carbon by 2050 for the group of 4 Northwest states, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And so I worked in Humboldt Bay and Coos Bay, Oregon, 2 of the leading port communities and rural communities that will be a part of the West Coast transition to floating offshore wind energy. Humboldt has a $420 million federal grant that is going to be backed by Crowley with another $420 million to build the wharf and the infrastructure area to actually put these out to sea. So one of the unique things, I'm going to focus on Humboldt because it's further along than Oregon is, and the auction has already been completed. But it's a small rural area. I interviewed community members down there. It was founded as a logging and fishing town. Those resource extraction industries have shrunk, and the wealth has kind of shrunk in that area as well. So one of the most important things that I'd like to talk about in this space is the expansion of environmental justice into civil justice and human rights, because like Leah and Kurt said before, a lot of these people aren't looking at the future of what is going to happen, but they're looking at the current inequities that they're facing right now. So I'll also bring up that this area has very steep landscape and is surrounded by protected forests. So they have a poverty rate that's 20%, which is about 8% higher than the state, up to 34% in Arcata, which is on the north end of Eureka and the Bay. And 21% of Humboldt is severely housing cost burdened. That means 50% of their income is going just to housing. So this has an important issue in capacity, is if you have to spend that much money and work all those extra hours at a low income job, then you don't have the capacity to engage in co-benefit creation and these community benefit agreement systems. So my results, when I talked to these people, I framed the discussion a little bit differently. I talked about what did they love and what provided them pride and satisfaction in their communities. And what came back was everyone loved the environment there. They loved their families and the rural culture. And then what they talked about is problems. They had problems with the jobs and economy of those high-paying timber jobs leaving and being replaced by service jobs, housing affordability, and homelessness. All 3 of these issues are intrinsically connected, and it is the overriding concern of the whole West Coast, basically. Everyone we talked to talked about housing affordability, homelessness, and increasing family wage jobs. But when we talked about offshore wind benefits, they wanted those new economy jobs. They wanted to work towards protecting the climate. But their big concerns were a distrust of government, a lack of information, and that money would leave the community, and also that housing costs would increase. So at this, the CETI, the Clean Energy Transition Institute, they also found that affordable housing was the highest priority for rural and tribal communities. Again, Blue Lake Rancheria, a tribe down in Humboldt, their number one priority is housing. So when we're looking at community benefit agreements to help these types of communities, we have to focus on the crises, the socioeconomic crises that are impacting these communities right now today. I'd also like to point out that the main funding mechanism in floating offshore wind and offshore wind in general is through community benefit agreements through bidding credits. So that's the initial lease bid. So the California auction for that Humboldt area was $158 million, and 20% of that was going to go to community benefit agreements. However, the most recent auction in Maine, on the other side of the country, for an area that would power even more homes, 2.5 million versus 1.5 million, the bidding was only $22 million. So many times less than the last bidding credit. And it's a 25% CBA allocation, but that's so much less money than we have in California. So there's incredible market volatility due to the political nature of these developments. So we cannot rely exclusively on these bidding credits to make sure that there's lasting and impactful benefits in the communities going forward. We need to think about other funding mechanisms beyond these initial bidding credits because of this market volatility. And then, as we talked about before, the co-creation of benefits is underway, and critically funding these options for the organizations is already being incorporated. One important fact for these types of benefit agreements is if you aren't incorporated already, you should be getting incorporated, or you need to partner with the organizations that are already in these discussions, because if you don't have some sort of incorporation, then you can't really participate legally in some senses. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that the housing costs in this area have increased over 200% since 2000, and wages have increased 80%. So all of this is just weighing down these communities. And I mentioned there's really steep areas and protected nature around Humboldt Bay. And the largest buildings in that community are over 100 years old. There's 6-story buildings that are 100 years old. And they've had a really strong NIMBY base that hasn't allowed larger buildings in those areas. But there's a unique opportunity with the rezoning of these industrial areas and the focus on worker housing to leverage those partnerships to create newer, higher density structures and meet community needs and desires by incorporating the desires of these corporations to house their workers, and thereby not offset the current housing availability. So I thought that was an interesting development over time. And I think there's leverage points within the system that need to be understood by evaluating the system as a whole. So you can look at new opportunities to innovate in the just transition space.
Okay, thank you very much. Very thorough, both of you. Who are you? Okay, anyway, I was just gonna ask who was supervising you, but never mind.
Yes, thanks for your supervision, Yoshi. It was great working with you.
Right. Okay, thanks a lot. So Matthew, I have a question. Now, we talked about like just transition. You study as a labor and included with climate justice, and it also talks about like social justice. So there's like a labor, climate, social, all the justice within it in this just transition narrative or discussion. From your point of view, is it too much? Are those three incompatible realistically, to push this just transition? So we should be really focusing on one, or shall we actually seek for the opportunity to really make a just transition, even under this political climate, to be something else? What do you think would be the most important thing we need to focus on? Shall we focus on the climate, or shall we focus on the labor? Shall we focus on the social? What do you think?
I don't think it has to be a either or, for what it's worth. I think this is, sort of the beauty of this idea of radical incrementalism in part, because, you are working in context-specific places, communities communities are diverse places with competing goals, but to the extent that you're able to sort of like come to agreements locally and work towards your priorities, that can include equity, that can include labor, that can include sustainability or climate priorities.
Climate people asked you for the bigger impact. How do you answer to that?
The bigger impact. So, I mean, the bigger impact to this point, if we sort of pursue realistic solutions, or as we think about like the sort of mega projects that are on offer, is that we see a pretty weak correlation between the adoption of renewable energy and climate mitigation. And to sort of, again, borrow from Ozzie Zahner, we're still also adding on new environmental problems, right? That relates to like the extraction of precious minerals, the disposal of degraded materials, all of that. So, if you take the macro view, like there's a problem, right? But, there is some evidence, I think, I'm looking at Gerald's question here. There is some evidence that these sort of local projects do sort of encourage something that's like degrowth adjacent when you're thinking about renewable energy co-ops at the local level. By democratizing the energy system, that makes people more conscious of, the sort of energy that they're consuming, because they're also the ones bearing the burden. They're also the ones making the decisions, and like this is going to have consequences for our local communities. So it includes people in the procedure, includes people in the decision-making process, while also sort of prioritizing those other factors that might be important to communities, which would include labor. I also, if I can, I don't want to talk too long. We have lots of great panelists here. With labor, though, it is also important to think about like sort of in environmental sociology, we talk a lot about the treadmill of production, and that's the way in which organized labor has been complicit or actively advancing environmental degradation through a partnership with the state and with capital. But the US, it doesn't, again, have to be this way. If you look at the US system of labor, which has sort of like lost power over the course of a few decades, and compare it against like organized labor in Germany. Organized labor in Germany, coal workers, for example, they're more militant and they're more supportive of a just transition framework. It's not about like, I just need to keep my job, because, there's a different approach and stronger advocacy for sort of decline of the coal industry.
Thank you. Kurt, I'm going to come back to you on that. But before I'm going there, Leah, we in this conversation, your approach is really important, because that's the sort of things historically people kind of like don't really talk right on the head. But I also wanted to ask, for your gender analysis plus approach, how do you actually measure the success? I mean, can we actually do something intangible? Something tangible instead of intangible? What do you think, instead of sort of like creating more jobs for women, kind of like a development bullshit? What would you propose for the measurement of the success from your lens?
That's a very good question. It's a challenging question. I mean, I think you have to come at it from a bunch of different angles, in a way that, one is that the people in the communities involved have to have a say in what constitutes success. And so that's got to be part of it. We can look towards indicators, kind of traditional indicators, and maybe more non-traditional indicators. I think, we can always be looking at things around employment, things around training. That's complicated because, I mean, there's really not good data out there. Disaggregated data is not being collected, so that's kind of a huge problem. I think we can also look at, if we can be sort of looking at what in the employment side of it, not just the numbers, but like, what is the situation like in the job? Is there flexibility? Is there childcare? What kinds of supports are there for making safe workspaces? I think at the same time, then we can also be looking at more kind of at the community level and be watching for changes in the community level around, you know, are there indicators of like social stress? Is there more violence against women? Is there, you know, what's the housing situation like? And sort of monitoring those things. And then also just kind of using a community wellness lens. And so I guess that's kind of my short answer on that.
No, thank you so much. If we had more time, I can ask you for the case studies from Labrador, and then you probably be able to answer more, but we'll create another opportunity for that. Good. You know, you'll talk about the labor, right? So I'm gonna ask very simply, is more job answer to your demand of the just?
No, probably not, no. Jobs are usually not the big issue when we come to communities. It's usually not just. It is economic, but it's about economic disbursement and how that's what we saw in our last election. We had ballot initiatives in Washington and 2 climate policies. One showed an economic benefit for the citizens of Washington that passed 60-40. The other one, people were concerned about the economic cost that failed. So the real life economy really does matter, and that's why I think labor, at least not necessarily organized labor, but the politics of labor and bringing food to the table is critical to all of these conversations. To have the capacity to have broader conversations in this space.
Thank you so much. Well, so we talked about housing. We talked about like, okay, what's the problem right now? Let's really aim for that and use just transition as a vehicle to address those issues. That's kind of like what I was getting from your thesis and everything before going to the community benefit agreement. One of the things I'm just wanting to ask you is, okay, so for the housing, for all this, is it really, okay, I'm gonna ask, be simple. Is it like a money? So is it like a money and the funding or financial system that needs to be there to go to bring the money to the community? Or is that something else that we really need to look for?
Money is a part of it, but the housing issue, especially on the West Coast, a lot of it has to do with the regulatory structure. There's a lot of regulation in terms of building in California, and that's true in Washington as well, and it's true in parts of Oregon, though less so. And we do notice that less regulation in Oregon has left us with lower housing costs there. The problem in these rural communities is the living wage, basically. So it's less and less likely that these communities are able to support more than just themselves on that income. And if we look at, say, Colorado, where they post salaries for building the turbine blades that Vestas builds for these offshore wind or onshore wind windmills, these initial workers are making $17 an hour. Someone who is not cost burden would have to be making over $23 an hour in Humboldt County. And minimum wage there is $16 an hour. So it's highly probable that some of these manufacturing and operations jobs that are going to be built in these communities is not going to lift a lot of these workers out of poverty. If the company is stable and productive over time, it may be able to lift them up as they move forward within the organization. But the crisis is twofold, both how much do you earn and how much do you pay for the housing. And that's why I proposed that interesting idea of building larger structures in support with the development, because they have these big swaths of land that are near the new facilities, can lower commute times. Also, all these projects are associated with environmental mitigation. Since they're going to be building these wharfs along the shore, they're also mitigating other areas and rehabilitating them and fixing the environmental consequences of prior industries. So if we can get communities up next and abutted to these projects that are restoring the thing that they hold so dear, the environment, then they will react to these projects in a more positive way because they'll see the results. A lot of these huge projects like floating offshore wind 40 miles offshore, are they going to see the results? And those results can either be economic, they could be spiritual by living next to these improvements, but also there's a lot of people who want to be involved. One of the top concerns that we saw interviewing communities was they wanted community involvement as well in both the construction of projects, working in the industry, and having a seat at the table. So it's complicated, but there's opportunity to leverage the situation into the most critical areas that are truly harming the communities right now.
Okay, but I'm coming back to Will and Leah for the last comments. What you said, Will, is the idea to address immediately, you know, the demand of the community.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you know, so how can we actually make it or break through this status quo narrative? You know, although it is just wonderful to address the real issue right now, well, that's realistic, you know, narrative that I'm repeating. That shouldn't be the end of it if we really truly focus on the just transition. So thanks, Will. Thanks, Kurt. Great comment. I'll pass it to Will and Matthew and Leah to give us a closing comment, if that's okay. We're passing time, but Matthew?
Sure. I will just close by saying, you know, I was really happy to be a part of this conversation. I think a lot of interesting points were raised by my co-panelists. And in particular, I think you all did a very good job of sort of speaking to the holistic nature of, you know, it's important to take a sort of holistic approach to these interventions and be weighing, you know, the inequities that sort of like interlock with the specific issue. I think you all did that better than my paper accomplished. So yeah, very happy to be there.
Leah?
I think I just want to say something that Matt said from his talk, and that I really kind of latched onto was this idea of being unrealistic. And I think that that's a really, it just made me think about our roles as sort of scholars who are kind of in between the wanting to be in the scholarly theoretical world and also in the real world. And that idea of thinking kind of unrealistically about what we should be doing just kind of got me thinking. And so thanks for that.
Thank you very much, all of you. Very different opinions, you know, from critical to the practice and alternative, you know, those are very important views. And then I have to say, you know, our job stays the same. You know, under whatever the political change is really coming to, you know, what we're really seeking for is seeking for the justice and equity and really addressing who our client is, which in my mind is a community. So we just stay as we are and hope to the best. And thank you very much for the question, Gerald. I think Matthew answered it. So we'll just go from that. Okay, audience, thank you very much. It's past 1 o'clock and here in East Coast and past over there in West Coast. I hope everybody's going to be safe and please take care. Really appreciate you coming to listen to us under this condition at the moment. And thanks a lot. Any question, anything else, please reach to Ocean Nexus. And yeah, we will be happy to reply to any of your comment. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the presenters.
Thanks all.